Hey everybody, and welcome to Stars and Swords. I'm Alistair Stevens, and this week on the show we are going to hopefully do a little better than we did last week, and our titanic accomplishment of covering 2 complete chapters of Bram Stoker's immortal Dracula. This week, hopefully, chapters 3 through 7, though I will admit, having looked at my slides already, chapter 7 is probably ambitious, but we will at least, I promise you, clear all of Transylvania and get some introductions to our supporting cast in the rest of this book. This is my first time broadcasting live on YouTube since COVID showed up and ravaged my house at the beginning of October. So please forgive me if my voice still isn't quite back to where it should be. Please forgive me if there are occasional coughs, hesitances. Unlike the dear Count, I do myself drink red wine, so that will keep me company through the rest of tonight's proceedings. Before we begin, a quick follow-up on an offhand remark that I made during last week's show, because such is my way. I mentioned last week about Jonathan Harker venturing forth from London into the wilds of the East, from the safety, the comfort, the security, the civilization of Victorian London into the wilds of the East, and casually compared him to one Bilbo Baggins of the Shire. And I spent a little bit of time this week. I spent a decent amount of time this week, a little more than I ought to have done, honestly, looking at the construction of the maps of Middle-earth that Professor Tolkien rooted his cosmology, his legendarium in, and finding their analogies, finding their applicabilities, forgive me, Professor Tolkien, finding their applicabilities to maps of prehistoric, particularly Ice Age Europe. And to cut a long story short, here's the deal. It turns out that the Lonely Mountain, it turns out that Erebor could conceivably be in the Carpathian Mountains. It could conceivably be, if you map Middle-earth onto Iron Age Europe, it could conceivably be adjacent to Transylvania, which I find oddly rewarding, quite frankly, at this point in our discussion. It's an interesting thought. Obviously, there aren't many connections between the two journeys, and we will see in this week's reading how Jonathan Harker behaves in a decreasingly Hobbit-like fashion as he comes under the sway of Count Dracula, and to some extent under the sway of Castle Dracula too. We'll talk about that as we progress. To pick up then from last week, Harker arrived at Castle Dracula in Transylvania amidst much foreboding, forewarning, foreshadowing. All of these fours went before him. And he spent some time getting to know the Count. He witnessed the defenestration of his shaving mirror right at the end of last week's reading. And this week, things get worse. In the interests of expediency, we will begin chapter 3. I will prep my first slide, though we're not quite ready to jump into it. We will begin chapter 3 with Harker realizing that he is a prisoner inside this castle, spending some time lamenting that. And we get this rather brilliant and explicative passage, I suppose. This is illustrative of Harker's character at this point. Quote, "I am, I know, either being deceived like a baby by my own fears, or else I am in desperate straits, and if the latter be so, I need and shall need all my brains to get through." And we can contrast here, I think, a certain innocence, a certain naivete, a certain associating of superstition and the otherworldly with childhood, with childlike innocence, with a lack of faculty, a lack of, crucially, that Victorian rationality, but will oppose that with the idea that if Harker can but keep his brains, if he can but keep his mind cool, then he will, of course, triumph. Because he's realizing now that he is beset by things which kind of defy his own rationalist explanation, but he still believes in the power of the rational to conquer these things. And stick around, because that's one of the major themes and motifs of this book as we progress. So I wanted to call that out, and we'll actually circle back around to part of that later in tonight's reading. For now, though, let's progress on to our first slide of the evening as we learn that Dracula has no servants. I had hardly come to this conclusion when I heard the great door below shut and knew the Count had returned. He did not come at once into the library, so I went cautiously to my own room and found him making the bed. This was odd, but only confirmed what I had all along thought, that there were no servants in the house. When later I saw him through the chink of the hinges of the door laying the table in the dining room, I was assured of it, for if he does himself all these menial offices, surely it is proof that there is no one else to do them. This gave me a fright, for if there was no one else in the castle, it must have been the Count himself who was the driver of the coach that brought me here. This is a terrible thought, for if so, what does it mean that he could control the wolves as he did by only holding up his hand in silence? How was it that all the people at Bistritz on the coach had some terrible fear for me? What meant the giving of the crucifix, of the garlic, of the wild rose, of the mountain ash? So, for all his breeding poise, learned civility, and natural aristocracy, Dracula demonstrates that he is not a proper gentleman at all because he lays the table and makes the beds. And this is, I think, to modern eyes, perhaps a little foolish. Why shouldn't someone make a bed? Why shouldn't someone lay the table? But we have to remember that in some part, the role of the noble, the role of the aristocrat, the role of the boyar, of the duke, or even of the lowly count, is in a sense to support their household. It is in a sense to give employment, right? One of the reasons that you live such a lavish life is to provide a home and sustenance and maintenance for the staff that provides for you. That's a part of the feudal order of things. Dracula isn't broaching social rules by making a bed or laying the table. There's something subtler at work here. He is inhabiting the role of a nobleman without fulfilling the most basic part of that role, without providing support to the staff of his household. We then get, of course, the realization that Dracula was the coachman, which is a bit of a stretch. You know, I don't necessarily think it's impossible for Count Dracula to have hired a coachman instead, but Harker leaps to the conclusion, and the text gives us no reason to doubt his inference here. And it's interesting, right, how that realization changes the nature of Harker's fear, his speculation, his inference, his understanding of what happened out there on the road with the wolves alters because he realizes that it was Count Dracula himself who was controlling these wolves with the raise of his hand. It's different somehow if a common coach person manages to control the wolves, because that is the realm of the common folk. It is the realm of common superstition. It is the realm of simply an unknowable place far to the east, the barbaric and wild east. When it's in the hands of Dracula, it is subtly different. It is, I don't know, more personified, perhaps. It is more in the noble tradition. It is a power to be wielded more than a power to simply exist within. I find that a fascinating distinction as we move through the book. And of course, the memories here of the gifts, the rising sense of dread and tension. I'll just footnote this right now and say the rising sense of dread and tension throughout this reading this week, at least until we cut out to Mina's first letter, is fantastic. I'm going to talk more about that when we get to the end of it because it is just so good, and I want to use some terminal punctuation on our discussion of Harker's journals here. But to note that right now, God, it's really good. We're going to talk a lot about it as we progress. That night, Harker questions Dracula about his family history, and we get a long, uninterrupted piece of attributed dialogue detailing Dracula's past, seeking to connect himself to this noble tradition from which he draws his name ambiguously, right? We'll talk about some of the possible speculation that we might engage in as far as that goes, because it is possible too that he is offering an account of his own accomplishments. Let's get to the slide and we'll see what we make of this. We Shikelis have a right to be proud, for in our veins flows the blood of many brave races who fought as the lion fights for leadership. Here in the whirlpool of European races, the Ugric tribe bore down from Iceland the fighting spirit which Thor and Woden gave them, which their berserkers displayed to such fell intent on the seaboards of Europe, aye, and of Asia and Africa too, till the peoples thought that they were werewolves themselves had come. Here, too, when they came, they found the Huns, whose warlike fury had swept the earth like a living flame, till the dying peoples held it in their veins ran the blood of those old witches who, expelled from Scythia, had mated with the devils in the desert. Fools, fools! What devil or what witch was ever so great as Attila, whose blood runs in these veins? And so on, and so forth. Obviously, his lineage is important to Dracula, right? It is more than just a representation of his position in society. It is more primal than that, more elemental than that. It is a more crucial part of his identity as he describes it to Harker. You know, obviously this passage that I'm presenting here runs on and on. I couldn't pull the whole thing, but it's fascinating stuff and really does open us up to some speculation regarding Dracula's long lifespan. The way that, even as Harker notes, he flits between describing these events as though they happened to others and describing these events as though they happened to himself is fascinating. And it's not necessarily, you know, again, we must beware the irony with which we might approach this text as modern readers steeped in vampiric lore. It is possible to read this as an account of a family line that has run down to this incarnation of Dracula, but which is so important to him that he associates himself very powerfully with the accomplishments and achievements and great strength of these forgotten previous generations, forgotten by all but himself, crucially, left alone here in this crumbling castle. It's fascinating, and it does absolutely incline us, I think, toward a reading that suggests that Dracula is perhaps more long-lived than we might otherwise suspect. Though, again, I don't think that we judge Harker negatively. I don't think we judge him harshly for failing to pick up on that speculation right now. I think, or at least, partially picking up on that speculation. There's nothing condemning here in Dracula's words. What's much more interesting, though, is the way that we run together so many of these myths, right? This cauldron of the Carpathians is stewing all of this mythology, all of these old tales, right? We get the berserkers from the north, we get the witches of Scythia, we get the devils in the desert, we get all of these different traditions, and of course the Hun tradition coming from the east, the bloodline of Attila himself, right? Which leads us to directly, Vlad Tepes, to the Impaler, the real life inspiration for Count Dracula himself. These different influences combine to give us something that is rich but also difficult to predict because it isn't delineated, right? There's this temptation in the modern mind, I was about to say, and certainly that is true, but also in the Victorian mind, right? There is a temptation, particularly if you are a Victorian student of classics, to neatly delineate. These are the Greek gods and the Roman gods and the Norse gods, and they shall, belong to separate pantheons, all of which are in their way insufficient, all of which are in their way adorable, but not true to the modern rigorous Victorian mind. But here, as we did before, right? As when Harker turned to his polyglot dictionary and all of these words for dangerous foes and monsters in the night kind of ran together and gave us something that was more bewildering, that was more bewitching, that was more otherworldly than we might have expected at that point, right? We're not getting a detailed schematic of what is and is not a vampire versus what is and is not a werewolf, or what is and is not a, Transylvanian chupacabra. We're not delineating those. We're having them coexist. And the thing about allowing all of these mythologies to coexist is that they tangle in really interesting ways, right? Because, just directly in this short passage, we have the berserker fury of the Icelandic Nords. We get this rampaging influence from the north combining with the bloodthirsty, conquering instincts of the Huns from the east, and all of this is as these peoples exist in the Victorian imaginary, right? As these people exist in their own mythologies and mythological contexts rather than actual, history. But we're combining these things in a way that doesn't just give these resonances, doesn't just give these similarities and this applicability between these references, but just refuses to allow us to settle into a single understanding. What is Dracula? Becomes even harder to understand when he's drawing on all of these sources, on all of this mythology. And of course, we might be tempted, rigorous and analytical as we are, good Victorian people as we are, we might be tempted to even question how much of this is true, how much of this is genuine, how much of this is folklore and superstition and belief, how much of this does Dracula himself believe. And also that is going to be a significant factor as we move through this week's reading too. What does truth mean? Last week we spent some time with the author's note, kind of getting into the idea of the epistolary novel as a documentary account, and also this collection of letters and documents as being something that is scrupulously true. But we're going to push back against that pretty hard in the pages to come. In fact, let's get to that so that we can push back against it directly. At the end of this conversation, Harker gets this moment of self-awareness as he notes that all of these journalistic accounts, all of the things that he is writing, terminate all of them right before dawn, right? And he has this reference to Scheherazade. He has this quote. It was by this time close on morning and we went to bed. Ma'am, this diary seems horribly like the beginning of the Arabian Nights, for everything has to break off at cockcrow, or like the ghost of Hamlet's father. We'll pick up with Hamlet later in our reading, of course, but it's nice to have that self-aware acknowledgement of the structure of the story, but also of how strange that is, of how alien this rhythmic structure is to Harker, as distanced as he is from the comforts of London. Dracula warns Harker not to sleep in other rooms of the house. This is the nail. Let me warn you with all seriousness that should you leave these rooms, you will not by any chance go to sleep in any other parts of the castle. It is old and has many memories, and there are bad dreams for those who sleep unwisely. Be warned. We'll pick up with that in the near future too. Though we can pause perhaps to speculate, or at least to acknowledge, at this point, simply to acknowledge, because we're going to get stronger information about this. We're going to get a stronger perspective on this when we start talking about Lucy's dreams later in the book. But for now, it is clear that there is a connection between dreams and Dracula, right? Not least of all, because they start with the same two letters. I don't know if you guys noticed. This is the kind of high-level textual analysis that you can only find on Stars and Swords. But, Harker himself has already acknowledged this, trying in the first instance to rationalize it, to normalize it. Well, I'm away from home and I'm having all of this paprika and I'm enjoying all of these strange meals, and that's bound to upset one's constitution, But here again, we're getting Dracula himself acknowledging that there is an influence over dreams to be felt in Castle Dracula itself. Let's move on to our next slide then. Here we are. This, of course, classic Dracula iconography, which oddly isn't replicated in very many of the movies, right? But is so powerful. I'm kind of surprised that this insectile, or I guess explicitly reptilian quality of Dracula isn't replicated in more movies, because I find it very disturbing. Here we go. What I saw was the Count's head coming out from the window. I did not see the face, but I knew the man by the neck and the movement of his back and arms. In any case, I could not mistake the hands, which I had had many opportunities of studying. I was at first interested and somewhat amused, for it is wonderful how small a matter will interest and amuse a man when he is a prisoner. But my very feelings changed to repulsion and terror when I saw the whole man slowly emerge from the window and begin to crawl down the castle wall over the dreadful abyss, face down, with his cloak spreading out around him like great wings. At first, I could not believe my eyes. I thought it was some trick of the moonlight, some weird effect of shadow. But as I kept looking, and it could be no delusion, I saw the fingers and toes grasp the corners of the stones, worn clear of the mortar by the stress of years, and by thus using every projection and inequality, move downwards with considerable speed, just as a lizard moves along a wall. What manner of man is this, and what manner of creature is it in the semblance of man? I feel the dread of this horrible place overpowering me. I am in fear, in awful fear, and there is no escape for me. I am encompassed about with terrors that I dare not think of. Great horror writing from Stoker here. Just magnificent evocation of something that is so simple, so straightforward, right? There's no ambiguity in what he is seeing. It is just profoundly unsettling. It is crisp and it is clear. It is parsable, and that makes it worse because it is so defiantly inhuman, right? It's comparable to, I don't know. It's difficult to parse Stoker in the tradition of horror fiction because so much horror fiction kind of swings for the Lovecraft fences, right? It kind of all becomes eldritch and indescribable, but there is always something so beautiful about something otherworldly, something disconcerting, something nasty and terrifying that is presented completely flatly, completely literally. It is the kind of thing that Stephen King can do at his very best. It is the manga work of Junji Ito, right? If you've read any of Junji Ito's work, that is a thing that he absolutely excels at, is depicting something completely literally, with no kind of interpretive flourish, with no sense of impressionism about the image itself. It is just there before you and awful in its clarity. And that is what Stoker manages to communicate here. The crawling face down is so much worse because it's a simple rejection of the kinds of boundaries that exist for what the human body is capable of, right? It is a stark demonstration that Dracula is himself inhuman. There is a greater strength here, a greater force. These toes and fingers clinging to the corners of the stones, the every projection and inequality, right? As they move downward with considerable speed, just as a lizard moves along a wall. It is absolutely, starkly inhuman. The one thing I have a little bit of trouble parsing here when I say that it's completely clear and concise. The one thing that I have a little trouble parsing here is the cloak spreading out around him like great wings. I must admit I have trouble envisioning exactly what that looks like. Like how so, Bram Stoker? How so does the cloak spread about him like great wings? Like, is he moving so quickly that the cloak itself is still flowing, up the wall, relatively speaking? Is that what we're supposed to believe? Or is it the wind catching the cloak and kind of blowing it upward and outward? Is that, I have a little trouble picturing that part in my mind. So I will admit that when I picture this, as I do from time to time, I oftentimes denude Dracula of his cloak, not of the rest of his garments. Let's behave with some decorum here. But yeah, I generally, remove the cloak from my imagination just because I have trouble picturing exactly what that looks like. Harker continues to explore as the days pass. We are now on the night of May 15th into the 16th, and this is where things really kick up a gear. He begins at this point with the return to Hamlet, right? Here he quotes, "Up to now, I never quite knew what Shakespeare meant when he made Hamlet say, 'My tablets, quick, my tablets, 'tis meet that I put it down,' etc." That is not the right quote. This is actually Stoker borrowing from his friend Henry Irving, the famed Shakespearean actor, who would just casually change Shakespearean dialogue as the mood took him. The real quote here is, of course, "O most pernicious woman, O villain, villain, smiling, damned villain, my tables, meet it is I set it down, that one may smile and be a villain. At least I'm sure it may be so in Denmark." That's the quote. So it's a nice throwaway here that we're referencing Irving in the pages of Dracula. Harker, of course, finally sleeps in a room that is not his own, and as was foretold, bad things happen. Bad asterisk. It's hot vamp girls, you guys. All three had brilliant white teeth that shone like pearls against the ruby of their voluptuous lips. There was something about them that made me uneasy, some longing and at the same time some deadly fear. I felt in my heart a wicked, burning desire that they would kiss me with those red lips. It is not good to note this down, lest some day it should meet Mina's eyes and cause her pain, but it is the truth. They whispered together, and then they all three laughed, such a silvery, musical laugh, but as hard as though the sound could never have come from the softness of human lips. It was like the intolerable, tingling sweetness of water glasses when played on by a cunning hand. The fair girl shook her head coquettishly, and the other two urged her on. One said, "Go on, you are first, and we shall follow. Yours is the right to begin." The other added, "He is young and strong. There are kisses for us all." I lay quiet, looking out from under my eyelashes in an agony of delightful anticipation. The fair girl advanced and bent over me till I could feel the movement of her breath upon me. Sweet it was in one sense, honey sweet, and sent the same tingling through the nerves as her voice, but with a bitter underlying the sweet, a bitter offensiveness as one smells in blood. Two dark-haired girls that look like Dracula, one fair-haired and blue-eyed. These, there isn't an absolutely settled nomenclature for these three women. They are usually referred to as the brides of Frankenstein. Frankenstein. I'm sorry, I was arguing just earlier today about the bride of Frankenstein and how the bride of Frankenstein is clearly the monster's bride and not the doctor's bride. Thus, Frankenstein is equally applicable in later iterations of the story to the monster as well as his creator. Forgive me. The brides, in fact, of Dracula. They are sometimes referred to as the brides of Dracula. They are sometimes referred to as the sister brides of Dracula, acknowledging the odd quasi-incestuous spirit that is running through these scenes, this charged and dangerous and malevolent and toxic eroticism, quite frankly, running through all the scenes featuring these three women. I will probably use brides just as a shorthand here, but I do acknowledge that is a little loaded and a little complicated, not least of all because of the description, right? Two dark-haired women that look like Dracula, and one who is fair-haired, and blue-eyed, suggesting perhaps that the fair-haired, blue-eyed woman is Dracula's bride, wife, the mother of his children, who are presumably the other two women here. This seems to be supported by the two dark-haired women saying, "Yours is the right to begin," acknowledging the superiority of the fair-haired woman. We also see here some distinctions. I think this is going to be a longer discussion because, hey, this is where the sex comes in for really the first time. There's been some charged moments, but this is really where the sexuality and the eroticism of the vampire really arrives. And boy, it arrives just full bore here. We see some differences between the vampire women, between the brides of Dracula and Dracula himself, of course. And the greatest of these is the temptation. There's nothing about Dracula that is recorded in the pages of Harker's journal that speaks to this temptation, right? He finds himself compelled. He even, in certain moments, we might argue, finds himself ensorcelled, finds himself enchanted to some degree, but there's none of this desire, right? I felt in my heart a wicked, burning desire that they would kiss me with these red lips. It is a thing that he wants, right? The desire is wicked because it is sexualized, because he is supposed to be an upstanding Victorian gentleman who is affianced to Mina Murray, but here he feels this desire. He wants it. He even acknowledges that he doesn't want to write this down lest Mina read it because it is a shameful thing, but he wants it nonetheless, and that is important. It is distinct from his experiences with Dracula. Let's talk a little then about sex. Let's talk a little about the reading of these characters, because there is a reading, and this is, there's an entire academic subfield of eroticism in vampire novels, and honestly, there's a subfield of a subfield, eroticism in Dracula. This reading is led in part in the modern era by Christopher Kraft, his early 80s paper, Kiss Me With Those Red Lips, which I will link to in the show notes for you. There's a reading here that we're seeing this scandalous and upsetting inversion of traditional Victorian sexual roles and desires, because specifically Harker is about to be penetrated by the teeth of the fair-haired vampire. Kraft goes some distance in this by formalizing the idea of the vampire mouth, capital V, capital M, the unique focal point of erotic energy in this novel, and honestly a very large part of the erotic energy of the vampire subgenre at large. And I think that this is interesting and provocative, but it maybe betrays its, 1980s-ness in terms of a more modern queer reading of this text, because what Stoker here is doing, I think, goes further than like a pedantic redefinition of what is penetration in a sexual context, because we reposition sexual agency to the mouth. This is true of these women and also true of Dracula himself, right? The mouth is the focal point of all of the sexual connotation and the erotic energy of the vampire. And that challenges us in a number of ways, because one of the things that it does is destabilize the gender binary, right? Because everybody has a mouth, and mouths are actually very similar from person to person, regardless of gender identity or sexual orientation. They are kind of, there is no binary component to the mouth as there are to other sexual organs if you observe a gender binary there. And that destabilization is really interesting. Also by inference there, by extension, it destabilizes the idea of penetration as a sexually conquering and dominant act, right? Penetration is simply, if you take penetration to be significant, I'm saying penetration a lot in this episode, you guys. If you take penetration to be a sexually significant act, then here we have to acknowledge that it is at least potentially reciprocal, right? Because all mouths can penetrate in this way. I'm hesitant here, right? Because on the one hand, I get it. On the one hand, I get the titillating reading of this book. I get the idea that Stoker is wielding these sensual, eroticized women, and even the threat of violence, and even the threat of pain, and certainly the threat of wickedness and the taboo, right? I understand the argument that Stoker is just wielding these things to make his book engaging, that this is just a salacious and titillating interlude in a story that is going to take a very different turn, but I'm not sure that that's in any way complete, right? To step back from the idea of asserting whether or not that is a fair reading, I think it's an incomplete reading, because I do find here there to be something that is more challenging to our notions of gender. I do find here there to be something that is challenging, certainly, of our notions of monogamy, right? This mutual feeding upon a single target, the ownership of that target, the possession that we're about to see. In fact, let's move into this next slide, and I will. We'll have a point at which we can contrast what we previously discussed. Because one of the things that I really do want to do, right? We have these women coming in, acting in a predatory and ultimately penetrative manner to the feminine, passive, reclining Harker, right? We are absolutely categorically inverting normal sexual roles here in this scene. And that is only going to be challenged by the arrival of Dracula himself. We have him here.
How dare you touch him, any of you? How dare you cast eyes on him when I had forbidden it? Back, I tell you all. This man belongs to me. Beware how you meddle with him, or you'll have to deal with me.
The fair girl, with a laugh of ribald coquetry, turned to answer him. You yourself never loved. You never love. On this, the other women joined, and such a mirthless, hard, soulless laughter rang through the room that it almost made me faint to hear it. It seemed like the pleasure of fiends. Then the Count turned, after looking at my face attentively, and said in a soft whisper,
Yes, I too can love. You yourselves can tell it from the past. Is that not so? Well, now I promise you that when I am done with him, you shall kiss him at your will. Now go, go! I must awaken him, for there is work to be done.
So on the one hand, ahoy there, queer reading. How are you? Good to have you. I mentioned back in our introductory episode that I am absolutely here for a queer reading of Dracula. I am less convinced by a traditional homosexual reading. And of course, the traditional reading of Dracula is not a homosexual reading. But, the way that we are looking at this as a sublimated form of male homosexual desire, I'm just not sure that there's that much there. But what's there is absolutely here, right? Look at the end of that second paragraph there. The Count turned after looking at my face attentively. For how long has he been looking at Harker's face attentively? When did he turn to look at Harker? If only we had that information, right? The fair girl with a laugh of ribald coquetry turned to answer him. But is Dracula looking at them? Is he yelling at them when he's telling them to back off and leave Harker alone? Or is he indeed looking at Harker? Because the intimacy of the eyes being upon you is powerful. Obviously, we're going to see that in just in a chapter and a half's time, when Harker tries to deal with Dracula in a permanent way, thanks to the aid of a nearby shovel. That intimacy is powerful. It's important. It's compelling. And it's hard. If you're inclined toward a queer reading and you want to kind of lay your claim to a gender binary of some sort, then yes, I think you wind up with a homosexual hunger here, an appetite, certainly, right? You cannot deny that these scenes are erotically charged, and you cannot deny that that is being manifested here between a man and a man, right? If we're observing that gender binary. But I really do think that the relocation of sexual desire and sexual manifestation to the mouth challenges the gender binary in that really interesting way. And as I say, I've used the word several times now because I think it is the best word to use, because I'm not sure that Stoker comes along with a developed argument, right? I'm not sure he comes in with a new taxonomy of queer sex and sexual relations, but it does destabilize the gender binary. And of course, that destabilization is no trivial thing, because Victorian England is based on that gender binary. It's rooted in that gender binary. We're going to get an opportunity to talk more about this as we get to Mina, certainly as we get to Lucy later. But I would be remiss if I didn't invoke and call out this session. The other thing that I really want to call out here too is the much more subtle way in which the vampire brides are presented as being every bit as inhuman as Dracula himself. That is to say, the way that they are rendered hard, the way that they are rendered like stone, the way that we're told that their laughter is like the ringing, that harmonic ringing of a finger around a wine glass. A very odd and crystalline and upsettingly discordant but also concordant sound, right? It has that weird ability to self-harmonize. And here we see again a mirthless, hard, soulless laughter rang through the room. These women are not women. Even here, before, as he will later, Harker dismisses them entirely as fiends, as devils, right? There's something else at play here. They are not themselves quite human. Let's move on here, 35 minutes into tonight's recording. Let's move on to chapter 4, shall we? Someday I will learn. It's not today. Here we are. We do get an odd moment in the first paragraph of chapter 4. And I'd be really interested, actually, in what you guys make of this, because there are 3 moments in tonight's reading, actually one in last week's reading and 2 more in this week's reading, that I find really challenging to my understanding of the book. And partly this is because the nature of the epistolary novel is that it is incomplete. It is rooted in absence as much as in presence. There are these natural ellipses, right? Harker writes when he has time to write. Then he experiences something new and comes back to write about it. But we can't really speculate, given how much time passes in these chapters in particular. We can't, and of course, the intrusion of the author's note that tells us that everything that was not important is discarded according to the whims and judgment of some unseen author figure. There are things here that are clearly missing, but he seems to be jumping the gun. This is the thing that I'm specifically thinking of here in the first paragraph of chapter 4. Quote, he's talking at the end of this passage about, "It is now a sort of sanctuary, for nothing could be more dreadful than those awful women who are waiting to suck my blood." Now, the fair-haired woman comes very close to his throat. There is the sack containing the baby at the end of the chapter. He is certain, at least, that they are going to consume said baby. Is the sucking of blood a leap for Harker here? How does he know that that's what's going to happen? Like, specifically, how does he suddenly possess vampire lore? How does he suddenly know that this fair-haired woman wasn't going to tear out his jugular, or wasn't going to, I don't know, in some way absorb his life force more abstractly, but literally the sucking of blood? We've seen no evidence of that to this point, but here it's asserted by Harker. So is this Stoker giving him a certain perspective? Is it Stoker just leaking information? Is it carelessness, over so many revisions of this novel? Or is this proof, and I find this to be the most interesting point of speculation, is this proof that Dracula is indeed already feeding on Harker? That some part of Harker's mind understands what is happening? That there is some point beneath whatever enchantment clouds his senses, as we see very clearly at the end of this chapter. This is exactly what happens, right? Dracula will feed upon Harker, will be restored by that blood, and Harker will not remember it, and will even seek in that moment to rationalize his way out of it, to deny that, or at least to ignore the inevitable conclusion that it is, in fact, his own blood. Is Dracula already feeding on Harker at this point? I find it so interesting. I should mention the other... right. This is, I should also call out an odd anachronistic modernity in the previous description when he's describing the fair-haired vampire approaching his throat and the super sensitive skin of my throat. Dude, how's the skin of your throat? Is it super sensitive? You doing okay? I must move on. I cannot believe this is taking so much time. I'm having so much fun. I hope you guys are too. And if we wind up taking 20 weeks to go through Dracula, I guess that'll be okay. Stoker introduces here a time lock and increases, forgive me, the stakes with this beautifully wrought piece of gothicry. Dracula insisting that, I've pulled ahead to this new slide here and I have no intention of getting to it, so I'll come back to you. Excuse me, with the writing of 3 letters, each significantly postdated, which will be sent out under dubious circumstances back to England. Harker, again, here demonstrated to be not naive, right? Harker understands immediately what is going on here. He's quite attuned to this circumstance and understands, because this is within the realm of his own knowledge, what these letters are meant to do. That these letters are meant to provide an alibi for Count Dracula and to leave his fate much more ambiguous, to leave his fate somewhere in the center of Europe, but not tied specifically to Castle Dracula. Indeed, there will be a trail of evidence suggesting that he left the Count's abode peacefully. What's much more interesting here, I think, is, as I mentioned earlier, the way that we are pushing back on the epistolary structure of the novel itself, right? Our author's note tells us everything that is important has been included. Everything that is not important has been dismissed. Don't worry about it. You can trust these documents because they were recorded contemporaneously. These happened. This is the account of people who were on the ground. There's no dulling of memory here. This is absolutely how it happened. And then here we are in chapter 4, very specifically, with letters being fabricated, with documents being tampered with. The documentary chain here is insufficient. Is this Stoker pushing against his own structure as far as the book is concerned? Are we supposed to be questioning, as I think we all are at this point to some degree or another, are we supposed to be questioning the role of the narrator here? Are we supposed to be questioning what we are being told, how complete Harker's knowledge is, how incomplete Harker's knowledge is? How does this connect with his understanding that blood drinking is occurring within Castle Dracula despite not having experienced it firsthand? How are we to reconcile these two things? The focus, the attention, the emphasis that is put on the epistolary form by the author's note, and then oh, but letters can be fabricated. Letters can be lies. And furthermore, right, if you want to break away from this kind of kind of metatextual reading and just look at the text itself, it's fascinating to see Dracula subvert one of the tools of Victorian order. One of the ways, and I'm not just talking about the postal service, right, but in a broader sense, the document itself, the written word itself, subverting these things in order to exploit access to Victorian society is fascinating, because we're led to believe, and Harker clearly understands immediately, that this is exactly the same impulse, the impulse that leads Dracula to compel Harker to write these 3 letters, to offer this alibi, this excuse for his absence, and suggestion as to his ultimate fate, that this comes from the same impulse as Dracula's desire to learn English with complete naturalism, right? To be able to pass in the streets of London without anyone knowing that he is a stranger. There can be no suspicion attached to Count Dracula and his arrival in London. There can be no shadow cast over it, because suspicion renders one other. Suspicion draws attention, and the drawing of attention is something that Dracula has already expressed he does not want. So this cover story, this fabricated cover story, seems to be a way of avoiding attention entirely. And here he's using the tools of Victorian society in exactly the same way as you know, the way that he's employing an English solicitor to safely buy Carfax, in exactly the same way as he's holding Harker hostage in order to better learn English so that he can enter English society without drawing attention to himself. All these things are wielding the tools of Victorian England against the structure, the edifice of Victorian England itself. Let's move on here. Because the other thing that we're seeing, and this is the slide that I called up here somewhat prematurely, but hey, here we go. The other thing that we're seeing at this point, I think, is the very un-Bilbo-like cracking of Jonathan Harker's civil persona, I suppose, right? His gentlemanliness at this point. He's under terrific pressure, of course, but this is the point at which we start to see that slip. We'll remember his enthusiastic, inquisitive, curious, condescending, yes, right? His naturally superior dominance over these people of Central Europe back at the beginning of the book. But here it's taking a different tone. Quote, "Then I ran to the window and cried to them. They looked up at me stupidly and pointed, but just then the hetman of the Zhugni, I think it is, came out, and seeing them pointing to my window, said something at which they laughed. Henceforth, no effort of mine, no piteous cry or agonized entreaty could make them even look at me. They resolutely turned away. The litre wagons contained great square boxes with handles of thick rope. These were evidently empty by the ease with which the Slovaks handled them, and by their resonance as they were roughly moved. When they were all unloaded and packed in a great heap in one corner of the yard, the Slovaks were given some money by the Zhugni, and spitting on it for luck, lazily went each to his horse's head. Shortly afterwards, I heard the cracking of their whips die away in the distance." As ever, forgive my pronunciation, I'm a simple man. Undereducated, as always. The language used here, though, is fascinating, right? Because stupid means, dulled into insensibility. It can mean shocked into insensibility, but it's also a loaded word. Lazy, similarly, has a more benign, a less judgmental quality to it, certainly. But used here, it seems to be a little more pointed. He's becoming more critical of these people, the Slovaks in particular. Is this because they are in the service of Dracula? Is this because he understands that they are playing some role? Is it because they are clearly his enemies and their refusal to engage with him at all? Perhaps. But he is not showing the same kind of charitable curiosity and inclination, a dismissive and a superior inclination as he showed at the beginning of the book. And we can read here a little bit the first cracks showing in his personality. We'll see a more specific example of that in the near future. I'm just now trying to judge whether or not we will make it to the end of chapter 4. Let's see what we can do. On June 24th, Harker sees the Count leaving the castle dressed in Harker's own clothes, carrying his bag. He infers immediately, of course, again, because Harker is not stupid. Harker is not naive. He is absolutely capable of understanding what is happening as long as he has some kind of common frame of reference for it, as he does for these kinds of quasi-legalistic, clear your own name, keep your hands clean shenanigans. He understands exactly that the Count is leaving to relieve himself of those letters, to build this alibi for himself so that he can, when he reaches England, blend in and be as unmarked as any stranger. Yeah, this is the second quote here, to show that he is still thinking fondly of Victorian England and is still somewhat reliant upon the social order and structure that he left behind. He has this quote, "It makes me rage to think that this can go on, and whilst I am shut up here a veritable prisoner, but without the protection of the law, which is even a criminal's right and consolation," which, let me tell you, is a lot of faith in the social order, my guy. But that's to be Victorian. To be Victorian is to believe in the edifices which have been constructed. This is followed by Harker falling under enchantment again, and we must, of course, take a look at this passage. "I thought I would watch for the Count's return, and for a long time sat doggedly at the window. Then I began to notice that there were some quaint little specks floating in the rays of the moonlight. They were like the tiniest grains of dust. They whirled round and gathered in clusters in a nebulous sort of way. I watched them with a sense of soothing, and a sort of calm stole over me. I leaned back in the embrasure in a more comfortable position, so that I could enjoy more fully the aerial gambolling. Something made me start up. A low, piteous howling of dogs somewhere far below in the valley, which was hidden from my sight. Louder it seemed to ring in my ears, and the floating motes of dust to take new shapes to the sound as they danced in the moonlight. I felt myself struggling to awake to some call of my instincts. Nay, my very soul was struggling, and my half-remembered sensibilities were striving to answer the call. I was becoming hypnotized. Quicker and quicker danced the dust, and the moonbeams seemed to quiver as they went by me into the mass of gloom beyond. More and more they gathered, till they seemed to take dim phantom shapes. And then I started, broad awake and in full possession of my senses, and ran screaming from the place. The phantom shapes, which were becoming gradually materialized from the moonbeams, were those of the 3 ghostly women to whom I was doomed. I fled, and felt somewhat safer in my own room, where there was no moonlight, and where the lamp was burning brightly." Just an excellent, complex, seemingly effortless bit of horror writing, but belonging to a very different tradition. This is one of the ways in which the Vampire Brides seem to be very different than Dracula himself. Because this is fairy, right? The idea of floating motes of dust in the moonlight, this idea of enchantment, right? Leaning back into the embrasure, into the more comfortable position. Yes, he is being hypnotized. He is being enchanted in a very fairy sense. If you are joining me for Dracula and have not listened previously to my other podcasts, fairy and the fae are one of my absolute fascinations. I have no time. I have no time to delve deeply into it. Suffice it to say that this is a very different archetype, I think, than the boyar, right? The nobleman, the cruel and animalistic and feral, cloaked in culture, cloaked in civility, but still the animal beneath that we see from Dracula. This is something much more subtle, much more haunting, much more seductive, and much more tempting. And again, we'll hit that note that this is one of the ways in which the Vampire Brides are distinct from Dracula. Harker is tempted by the Vampire Brides in a way that he is never tempted by Dracula himself. Is this a repudiation, a rejection of the idea of a homosexual reading of that relationship, particularly from Harker's POV? Perhaps it's just a different kind of energy. Perhaps it's a different kind of enchantment. Perhaps it is that Harker can understand his own arousal and desire when dealing with the Vampire Brides in a way that he simply cannot when dealing with Dracula. That is a point of rampant speculation. There's absolutely nothing in the text to support that read. And if I've missed something, and there is something in the text to support that read, please do get in touch and let me know. After this, we shift narrative modes beautifully as Harker hears the voice from the courtyard. We have the woman there demanding the return of her child. Interestingly, here, Harker himself is mistaken, right? The woman shouts, quote, in a voice laden with menace, "Monster, give me my child." We know that Dracula has been impersonating Harker, right? He's been slipping out of the castle dressed in Harker's clothes, going to post Harker's mail, even as fraudulent as that is. But Harker in the castle, in the place of Dracula, is now taken to be the monster. He is misapprehended by the woman. She takes Harker to be Dracula. And there's an interesting reciprocity here, because even as Dracula summons the wolves, right, and they tear the woman apart in the courtyard, Harker is somewhat cool. There is a change to his intonation, a change to his characterization, we might almost say. The quote is here, quote, "I could not pity her, for I knew now what had become of her child, and she was better dead." Which is stark. That doesn't seem to be quite the Jonathan Harker that we met earlier, right? Capable of such empathy. Again, condescension, yes, but capable of such empathy. There's here a crueler judgment, right? I know what happened to her child. She's better off dead. There's no empathy there. There is simply judgment. Is this the influence of Dracula, of his circumstance, right? Is this just a hardening of his heart against Transylvania? Is this the influence of Castle Dracula itself? I think it's an interesting point of speculation. And then it's at this point, the morning of June 25th, when he's been there for like a month and a half, almost 2 months now by this point, that Harker, comforted by the sun after a night of dreams and angst, resolves to take action. He scales the wall just as Dracula did, presumably not head first, presumably in a more mundane way, finds it surprisingly easy, and then, playing ahead with the structure of the novel, right? This is exactly what I was talking about. These gaps in the epistolary account. Cutting ahead, we cut to the same day later, where we learn that he has found ancient gold in Dracula's unused room. He ventures downward to the ruined chapel, downward still further into the vault beneath the ruined chapel, where he finds the large boxes brought by the Slovaks, and inside one such box, the Count himself. I find this really fascinating. The way that we continually draw attention to these cliffhanger moments as Harker very naturalistically concludes each entry with something desperate, with something fierce, with some urgent need, and then we come in with, well, anyway, let me tell you what happened after that. These little pauses, this fractured timeline of narrative, these caesura, right, that interrupt the flow of the narrative. This is such a function of the epistolary novel, particularly in this journalistic form. I'm enchanted by it and its dramatic possibility, and I think that Stoker manages to wield it just brilliantly. I do know that some people find this a little frustrating and wish maybe we just had more of a regular third-person account where we weren't constantly doing this sawtooth, jagged edge of rising tension and then collapsing tension. But I find it extremely engaging. I find it extremely rich here. Suddenly, though, we cut ahead. I will note the hatred in Dracula's eyes that compels Harker to flee from the vault beneath the chapel in the tower. I'll note that there because of, obviously we'll return to that at the end of the chapter. Then we cut ahead 4 days as Harker tells us, quote, "Today is the date of my last letter, and the Count has taken steps to prove it was genuine, for again I saw him leave the castle by the same window and in my clothes." So not only is the Count alive, which is surprising because Harker just gave an account of the Count clearly lying dead in a box in a vault beneath a chapel, but we skipped over the part where Harker realizes that he's alive. This is another one of those moments where Harker asserts something to be true. I mean, in this instance, he has proof of it, of course, but previously, when did he realize that this was the case? What happened in those 4 days? And was that really not worth adding to this collection of documents? So we arrive at the end of Harker's stay in Dracula. We've got, what do we have? 2 more slides to complete the chapter and 7 minutes. Let's do this. I'm feeling feisty. I would not be able to hold my head high if out of the 5 chapters I was supposed to do, I didn't even complete 2. These are, I will say, though, the longest collections of slides that we're going to cover. The book not only accelerates in pace, but the addition of plot and the defocusing of a central protagonist through the rest of the book will allow us to move more quickly. There's simply more ground to cover, and we won't have to do such careful reading to really lay out. I mean, is it trite to say that the first 4 chapters of Dracula are the best 4 chapters of Dracula? Maybe a little. Is it trite to say that this is maybe just a good short story by itself and maybe even didn't need the rest of the book? That's certainly true. I think you can read the first 4 chapters and have a really rewarding and engaging vampire story. I think that what Stoker is doing, I think the reason that this exists is the rest of the book. I think that is the point of the story, is the rest of the book. But this is a really brilliantly contained short story. Let's move on to this next slide here. In silence, we returned to the library, and after a minute or 2, I went to my own room. The last I saw of Count Dracula was his kissing his hand to me with a red light of triumph in his eyes and with a smile like Judas in hell might be proud of. When I was in my room and about to lie down, I thought I heard a whispering at my door. I went to it softly and listened. Unless my ears deceived me, I heard the voice of the Count. Back to your own place. Your time has not yet come. Wait, have patience. Tomorrow night is yours. There was a low, sweet ripple of laughter, and Excuse me. And in a rage, I threw open the door and saw without the three terrible women licking their lips. As I appeared, they all joined in a horrible laugh and ran away. I came back to my room and threw myself on my knees. It is then so near the end. Tomorrow, Lord help me and those to whom I am dear. Again, another one of those climaxes, another one of those rising actions, the jagged emotionality, right? The fracturing of Harker's civility here at the end. There's nothing to do but to wail and to cry out and to pray here at the end of all things. An interesting wrinkle here, and the reason that I pulled this slide besides just this excellent rising tension, this slide is taken from the British text of the novel, while in the American 1899 text, Stoker adds, "Tonight is mine," between "have patience" and "tomorrow night," right? That part. "Have patience, tonight is mine, tomorrow night is yours." And that's really interesting because it speaks to so many things that may have been happening in Stoker's life, that may have been informing Stoker's experience of the book. Because when we're considering a queer reading of Dracula, to whatever extent we are considering a queer reading of Dracula, we must note that the book was published in 1897, 2 years after the public trial of Oscar Wilde for gross indecency. Oscar Wilde, the close friend of Bram Stoker. And Stoker, as we discussed in the introductory episode of this unit, was a man who had documented strong feelings for and about other men. And we might wonder about this additional emphasis that this revision puts on Dracula's connection with Harker. "Tonight is mine" is very different from "tomorrow is yours," and that's all we'll say about that, right? The active claiming of Harker, "Tonight is mine," is purposeful. It's intense. We might wonder whether that was excised from the British edition because things were delicate in Britain at the time. Things were delicate is to undersell it horribly. Things were horribly dangerous in Britain at the time for homosexual men in particular. This is only, as I say, 2 years separated from Wilde's trial, and Stoker may well have believed that a foreign market would simply be more permissive. That, we talked about his letter in the opening episode of this unit and how passionate and intense that was. He clearly believed that this was, well, I say he clearly believed, right? This is inference, this is speculation, but it seems very possible that this is him just putting his thumb on the scale just a little bit, just pushing what is possible within the pages of this book a little further, at least in terms of the intimacy, right? It may not have been explicitly sexual. It may not have been explicitly desirous. It almost certainly isn't in any way romantic, right? This is a predatory, manipulative relationship. This is not a romantic relationship. It isn't even really a sexual relationship. It is an analogy for a sexual relationship. And that is all. Is this a declaration of something deeper, of a truer feeling? Or is this simply a recognition that in England one had to edit more carefully to get around speculation and inference and gossip around such things? Let's take our last slide here for tonight as Harker decides to take a certain amount of terminal action. There lay the Count, but looking as if his youth had been half renewed, for white hair and moustache were changed to dark iron grey. The cheeks were fuller, and the white skin seemed ruby red underneath. The mouth was redder than ever, for on the lips were gouts of fresh blood, which trickled from the corners of the mouth and ran over the chin and neck. Even the deep burning eyes seemed set amongst swollen flesh, for the lids and pouches underneath were bloated. It was as if the whole awful creature were simply gorged with blood. He lay like a filthy leech, exhausted with his repletion. I shuddered as I bent over to touch him, and every sense in me revolted at the contact, but I had to search, or I was lost. The coming night might see my own body a banquet in a similar way to these horrid three. I fell all over the body, but no sign could I find of the key. Then I stopped and looked at the Count. There was a mocking smile on the bloated face which seemed to drive me mad. This was the being I was helping to transfer to London, where perhaps for centuries to come he might among its teeming millions satiate his lust for blood and create a new and ever-widening circle of semi-demons to batten on the helpless. The very thought drove me mad. So, he takes action, fails to take action. It's really here, though, the transformation of Dracula and the charged immediacy with which Harker responds to it, the revulsion that he feels, but also the conquering of that revulsion by his rationality, right? But it's a rationality that is safely delineated. It is blinkered. It is focused and limited. And if he were, to borrow from Shirley Jackson, to borrow certainly from H.P. Lovecraft, if he were to understand exactly what was happening, then perhaps he really would go mad, at least in that, awfully reductive mental health, gothic sense of the word, right? The way that people go mad in novels, which has nothing to do with mental health in real life. If he understood what was happening, perhaps the enormity of it really would collapse him. But he doesn't understand everything that's happening. He's refusing to process large chunks of it. His rationality is limiting the ways in which he can engage with this monstrous thing in front of him, and that is saving him. It is protecting him in some sense. I think perhaps we'll circle back to exactly what is happening here with the Count and exactly what happens in that moment of enchantment, of fear, of manipulation. Let's leave this, in fact, as an open question. By all means, get in touch and let me know. Stars and Swords pod, at gmail.com, or you can head on over to starsandswordspod.com and use the handy dandy contact form right there. Get in touch and let me know. Does Dracula's head literally turn? Does the expression on his face change as Harker is standing there? Or is this all in the head of someone who is, to some extent or another, becoming a thrall of the vampire? We'll call that the end of chapter 4. We'll call that a win. How about that? We'll call that a win. That's the end of Jonathan Harker. We are going to get, all but the end of Jonathan Harker, we are going to get on to Mina Murray and Lucy Westenra next week and further beyond. We will, of course, pick up the pace at this point. As I said earlier, before we wrap up completely, a quick recommendation here in the traditional plug section of the Stars and Swords podcast. I have a new podcast, you guys. It is called Don't You Know Me By Now. I record it with the wonderful Elizabeth Ray. It is a step-by-step, scene-by-scene exploration of 3 of my very favorite films. Richard Linklater's Before trilogy, Before Sunrise, Before Sunset, Before Midnight, starring the wonderful Ethan Hawke and the equally wonderful Julie Delpy. Really, really great films that I have loved for 20 years at this point, more than 20 years. Good Lord. Don't think about how long it's been since you watched Before Sunrise for the first time, you guys. It's been a minute. I love those films. And we started recording this very conversational, very spontaneous, kind of unedited conversation, taking each of the vignettes from those films in order and discussing them. The first episode is available now. You can find it at knowmepod.com. That's knowpod.com. You can find it there. You can find it on iTunes. You can find it on YouTube. You can find it all the places you would expect to find a podcast these days. It's really fun. I think it's really good, and I hope you guys will enjoy it. Please do check it out. And of course, if you like what I do here at Stars and Swords, if you would like bonus episodes, if you would like to encourage me to extend the time of these episodes past the somewhat self-inflicted 1 hour time scale that I've given myself now, then head on over to patreon.com/nextword, patreon.com/nextword, and pledge your support. Pledge $5 a month and help me keep making podcasts all the live long day, because honestly, had I but whirled enough in time, I think we all know this is all I would do. Thank you so much for joining me this week. Thank you so much for putting up with my voice. We mostly made it through, right? Just a couple little moments here and there, but mostly okay. I really appreciate your time. I really appreciate your attention. And as always, there are bad dreams for those who sleep unwisely. Be warned. Thanks for listening. Good night.